Now, when Charlie and Tabitha asked me to come and speak at CogX this year on the subject of the future of the company and the future of company leadership as we transition to the exponential age and in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I couldn't think of anyone better to have that discussion with than my former boss, Tom Glocer, who, as Charlie mentioned, used to run Thomson Reuters and is now on the board of 3 major public corporations, as well as investing at the other side of the scale in early stage companies. So Tom, thanks so much for agreeing to join me in this conversation.
What a pleasure, Azeem. I mean, we used to I don't get a chance to see you as much as we used to. For those of you who didn't know about that phase in Azeem's fascinating career, he was running the innovation program at Reuters, where we were trying to seed interesting ideas, things that were consistent with the company's mission, but typically involved applying information technology into a new domain. So we got to spend a lot of time there, and I got hooked on the exponential mind then.
Well, if I remember correctly, I joined Reuters in 2005, but you took over as the CEO in 2001, just a couple of weeks after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York. What was it like leading a global organization through a crisis like that? And are there parallels for leaders today?
You know, I think there are. What I remember from the time was, I was completely inexperienced, a 40-year-old chief executive transplanted from the US to London when we watched those horrible scenes of the planes crashing into the buildings. And, we just went to the absolute basics. I remember a triage we put together of number one, safety of our own people. Could we account for everyone? What were the systems by which we could just get people to check in? And tragically, across the larger Reuters enterprise, we lost 6 on the day. The second was our customers. Lots of the international banks were in the trade centers, along with Cantor Fitzgerald and firms like that. And immediately the question came up: how can we help our clients? Can we get them back in business? Can we help their people? And then a very distant third was, what was the effect on the company itself, on Reuters, our finances? It was a somewhat parlous period for Reuters at the time. And so no one knew what the world would look like. And interestingly, as we've faced across the world the COVID pandemic, I see on the boards I'm at, and even on the small companies, a somewhat similar trilogy play out.
Yeah, it's a very similar prioritization. I've spoken to CEOs in companies like the NASDAQ and C-suite execs in a dozen other firms. It's very, very similar. There's a strong focus on, are our people safe? Do our people have what they need? Sometimes it's technology. One CEO mentioned to me that it was actually office chairs, that people were going to have to work at home for months at a time, and sitting on a kitchen chair wasn't going to do it. And then it was, again, trying to onboard and look after your customers and your customer obligations. There does seem to be something different about the COVID pandemic in terms of how it's shocked companies. I mean, 9/11 felt very painful, but very exogenous. It was like an asteroid almost, in a sense, hitting something, whereas COVID seems to have affected so many parts of our economy on the demand side and the supply side. I just wonder how much more complex the problem set is for the senior exec to navigate.
Yeah, no, I think it very much is. An interesting example is how quickly people have had to move to a work-at-home environment. James Gorman, who's the excellent CEO at Morgan Stanley, half jokes when he says that If we had been asked by our regulators, let's say the Bank of England or the Fed, as part of annual stress testing, please send 90% of your personnel home and let's see what your business continuity plans are. And by the way, we're going to crank up trading volumes by 3. As a board, we would have probably, said, you can't do that. That's a terrible risk. Can't we just try 25%? But yet, in the event, that is exactly what happened. Financial firms with their real-time orientation probably have it to a greater extent, but certainly live broadcast television has adapted. The really difficult ones are obviously the travel and restaurant and hotel industries.
Yeah, and actually to add to the sectors that find it complicated, anyone who was manufacturing and having to physically move something from somewhere, and today's manufacturing is so complex. It takes 1,000 companies to put together a simple widget that we might buy in the store. That they discovered, I think, a lot of fragility in their systems, and I'd love to explore that idea of fragility and resilience. But before we get there, I'm actually curious about how, for the firms who managed to make this digital switch so quickly, they were able to make it so quickly when, for anybody who's been watching large companies, they often have these rather unsatisfactory digital transformation projects that run for decades, and yet they were able to do it in a week. What does that tell us about what was going on in the companies?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Number one, of course, without the internet and without sufficient bandwidth, imagine if it was early days and we were all dialing up on 300 baud modems via AOL. It wouldn't look as seamless. The other thing, which of course is interesting, is how many goods are now already digital goods and therefore can move freely without the physical systems having to be there. I think we've also learned quite a lot about who are the essential workers and who are not. Folks like you or I, who spend most of our time in front of cameras and use brain and mouth, probably mouth a little bit too much in my case, we've been able to adapt quite well. I'm doing interviewing for senior jobs that we're hiring at various companies over video, board meetings, et cetera, and they're quite focused and more disciplined and they work well. But I don't consider myself by any means the essential worker in the world.
No, I think it is. It has been a stark learning experience about what we actually depend on and why to make our economies function. Now, I just want to put out a reminder for anybody listening that we do have a Q&A session after this conversation. So please do put questions into, I think it's the CogX app or into Slido, and then we can come to them when we get into the Q&A. Let's talk a little bit about resilience and efficiency. So the trope that's been running around for a while, and I have been guilty of writing this as well, is that over the last 30 to 40 years, this Anglo-American model of corporate leadership emphasized peak productivity, it emphasized efficiency over everything else, because ultimately resilience was something that incurred a cost that you would feel in your quarterly reporting. And I'm curious about whether you think that is a sort of fair assessment of where companies ended up, particularly those that are involved in manufacturing, and whether we think that as a consequence of this pandemic, there will start to be longer term shifts in the way that sort of firms think about their supply chains, they think about their partners.
Well, I think that's certainly true. Take in the pharmaceutical world. So I'm on the Merck board, and the science is fascinating. But when people wake up and realize that a large amount of the core pharmaceutical product that goes into the constituent elements that make up drugs actually are sourced from China. It's not a political view, it's a sort of fragility of the supply chain. People take notice. I think we've reached peak density for jamming people in and hot desking in offices. I think we've reached peak office for anything other than conference and team get-togethers. I think we've reached peak offshoring, whatever your definition of on or offshore is. You know, interesting, a lot of the Indian offshore entities, the Wipros and Infosys, et cetera, of the world, they also had to send their people home. So suddenly you have, let's say, a London-based bank which has a certain amount of its mid and back office done out of what they think are well-controlled, secure centers in wherever, Bangalore. And suddenly now it's a second level of people working from home, and from certainly a cyber defense point of view, a much larger attack surface of individuals. So all of that's going to have to be thought through. Final thought I'd add in on the fragility, just to give you a lot of meat to then reflect on, is, you know, the other trope is the world isn't changing. This just accelerates everything that was already happening. And one of the things you and I have talked about before is the whole sort of maker-bot phenomenon. And people were already building spare parts that way. I think we're going to see an acceleration, certainly, of that movement, because it's a lot easier to send the digital instructions for a replacement part than try and get it through physical supply chain.
Yeah, wow, we're going to get into a massive space here, which is fantastic.
We always do.
Yeah, so a couple, you know, on this point about peak offshoring, I mean, I think one of the arguments that I've made over the last few years is that even prior to the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House, there was already a move back towards reshoring, not driven by a desire to increase the amount of resilience, but simply because it was getting a bit expensive to put everything out to middle-class workers in India or factory workers in China. So the labor cost arbitrage was disappearing, and there were reasons to be close from an economic basis, but increasingly reasons for companies to want to produce their products nearer to where the customer was. Even in digital products, sovereign states were demanding data localization. So India saying, listen, if you're going to deal with data around Indian citizens, it's got to be in India. So although it is a trope that this idea of China plus one or reshoring has been accelerated by COVID, it is a hill that I will plant my flag on and say, I think this has been going on for several years and will continue to go on. And to your point about thinking about 3D printing and do we just pass the intellectual property around rather than shipping large amounts of manufacturers? You know, I think that is definitely something that we are seeing much more of. People tend to downplay the impact of 3D printing because we've seen those little additive manufacturing devices in schools and universities, and they don't seem to do much. But it is quite significant now in the aerospace industry, amongst other things. One of the things that I'm curious about is, and we didn't brief on this, but let's touch on it, is in a world where we ship around nothing more than intellectual property, does that then just increase the returns to the IP holders over the other people in the value chain? So essentially the large R&D rich American firms, whether they're in pharmaceuticals or technology.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. And it raises also the whole specter of sort of the tax, who pays tax in what jurisdiction. You know, will we all hold that IP in Switzerland at a low tax rate and sort of beggar thy neighbor across the world? So I think that is a very significant risk. You know, the way it tended to happen in companies and I think in countries is it was not a one single strategic decision to start, moving everything to India or another country, but rather the requests on a atomized series of division heads to improve their budgets, lower their cost structures, etc. And what we've had is a bit of a wake-up call that when you begin to look at things again holistically and not just optimized by its parts, you suddenly wake up one day and say, oh my God, what is our risk if there's flooding in Calcutta, for example? And those sort of questions, or the more geostrategic one with Huawei, which has been burning and creating a bifurcation of the internet, which is the US rational to worry that a downline load of firmware could introduce into Huawei 5G gear dangerous backdoors? And of course, the Chinese might ask, could that happen on Cisco gear? And
they perhaps should ask that question. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you do want to put questions to Tom and I, please put them in the CogX app or Slido, and we'll get them to them in the Q&A after this session. You've raised a really interesting point there, that a lot of the decisions that companies made are often made by harried business division heads, right, who have to hit certain targets. And it makes me think a little bit about the function of risk management, which is obviously quite well developed in financial institutions. But I wonder about what it tells us about the future of governance of these companies in an increasingly networked environment. You talked about how the attack surface is getting more complex, and your investments in cyber defense speak to that. But in an increasingly networked world, and we will maintain that degree of networkedness, how does that change how companies need to assess and organize themselves?
Oh boy, that's a good question. And as always in our conversations, there's this sort of poker playing, okay, I bid X and now I will add to you, rather than necessarily answer the question. So I'm going to add and venture in onto your fertile territory, which is, now imagine you add in, how do we think of risk and control when we add in as much machine learning as is going on now? So to back up a step or two, traditionally, certainly in bank regulation, but it's true across the risk management world, one thinks of three lines of defense. There is the actual line operation, and there are things like credit limits and concentration limits, et cetera, in trading. There is then a compliance function, which is still within the business, often reports up to legal, often is separate, which makes sure that you are complying with the variety of risk tolerances, risk appetite that's been set. And then there is a third function, as independent as possible, which is audit, which audits to see whether you're living up to what your policies are or best practice. All of those are engaged now in the current risk environment. But if you layer in, what is the three lines? How did the three lines of defense operate in a artificial intelligence world? Does the second line run the algorithms over a different data set to see if they come up with the same answer? Do you run different algos off of the same data set? What does it really mean? And this gets us into explainable AI, et cetera.
Well, I'm a little bit of an interventionist in this respect. So, I do think that the right way to tackle this is to not create exceptions around AI and machine learning as if it's some sort of, gift from a future superintelligence. It's just another tool. It is built using our existing tool sets. And so when we bring out a new tool like this, we need to think about how it needs to be regulated and how compliance needs to be managed. And I think that there's things that we can learn from the financial services industry, which include separating out the rulemaking from those who are going to be adjudged by the rules, which we do in certain parts of the industry, and for the compliance process to be something that is that the firms themselves are responsible for, but any kind of remedies being managed by somebody externally. And I think we've got the AI debate a little bit confused, because it's in the interests of the scientists and the engineers developing the AI for it to be created into its own special category. I mean, that's just a sort of that's what everyone wants to be, right? Everyone wants to be special. Tom, I'm cognizant that we've got about 7 minutes left in our conversation, and we've got a lot that we can talk about. I just want to remind the audience that if they do want to put questions to us, they can use the CogX app or the Slido. We'll take those in Q&A later. One thing I'd love to talk about, if we can, is what's happening in the US at the moment, right, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And I've seen a lot of corporate execs, from the CEO of Accenture through to senior execs at Citi, your colleague Ken Frazier at Merck, come out and make various statements about the issue of systemic racism in America and what they intend to do, what they think what changes are required, and what they intend to do in their organizations. And I think it's easy for people to look at that and write it off as virtue signaling and say, well, they're only saying this and they're going to forget about it and go back to their quarterly returns. I don't think that is what's happening. I think that by making these declarations in public in a way that is, in a sense, auditable, it's a kind of Ulysses contract that they will be held to, particularly by their employees, particularly the younger ones and the millennials in there, and also be held to them by the press and sort of civic society more broadly. But then I'm a kind of hopeless optimist. What's your take on how corporate leaders have responded to the murder and the racial tensions after that?
Well, number one, I'm really pleased, not surprised, that you refer to it as a murder, because it is exactly that. When one is so casual as to have your hands in pockets while keeping knee on neck for close to 9 minutes, that was certainly not a threat to the officer's life. Number two, I think you're right. There seems to be a realization that the time for hopes and prayers and nice sentiment, there will of course be some level of backsliding. There always is. But companies really have been galvanized, leaders have, and they're being told, it's not just the letter, it's what do you do? So let me give you an example from BlueVoyant, the cyber defense company that I co-founded. We've asked our staff of about 200, including and led by the African American community in the company, what we can do tangibly. And the ideas that have come back include the idea that we can offer, rather than just give money, which is useful, but give money to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is a very honorable institution. We're actually going to donate our own cyber defense services to protect organizations that our staff recommend, and some of them have already come under pretty fierce cyber attack from right-wing extremist groups. So that is something tangible that's part of the mission of the company that, yes, we will do for free, but it's something real, as opposed to just, we're terribly concerned and woke.
Yeah. So the sense would be that perhaps we're at a new energy level now with the statements that are coming out. I mean, from these execs, whether it's BlueVoyant or the larger firms. I mean, just as you look at your peer group, and it feels different, is my sense, just as in a sentence.
Yeah, and it needs to. I mean, we've been here before. There are a series of other issues like gun violence in America, where we've just had one tragic shooting after another, and everyone says this time it's different, Sandy Hook, Columbine, etc., Parkland, and it doesn't change. This one feels like people are in the streets, and it is going to change, and hopefully they'll go out and vote as well on November 3rd.
Now, we have about a minute left, and there is so much that we didn't talk about. I'm looking at my notes. We were going to talk about the mutualization of the corporation, the benefit corp, the B Corp, how you might create network-based companies as opposed to centralized corporations, the nature of change. So I'm hoping that we can take all about that in the question and answer session afterwards. And just a reminder to the audience, please do put your questions into the Slido. I see that Charlie is just turning up to shuttle us off. Tom, I've enjoyed this part of the conversation. I think we've got another opportunity to continue it.
That's great. Me too.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. So thank you both, Azeem. Thank you, Tom, for a wonderful, fascinating session. And please, for everybody in the audience, don't forget, if you want to join the breakout Q&A, go to the What's Happening section on the CogX app, and you can see it there, or you can filter by track and look for breakout Q&A and post your questions there. And Azeem, I know, is going to try and get to as many as he can. But for now, thank you, Azeem. Thank you, Tom. That brings this session to a close. We'll be back soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.